silent. In most cases, I'm going to begin our discussion of a new chapter today, a new topic today, which is hate speech. As you can imagine, this is something that is of tremendous relevance to India, given the number of occasions on which hate speech has become a topical issue and also has generated a degree of discussion and even controversy. So that is what we're going to be looking at. I have a few announcements to make which I'll do later on. We hope that the class will look slightly fuller than it is at the moment. So let's now begin to look at the issue of hate speech. And as in many other areas, there is a balancing act to be performed. And the balancing act here is between, on the one hand, freedom of expression, and on the other hand, the dignity of individuals, and also to some extent, the safety and security of people. Because hate speech, as you know, can lead to violence, and therefore result in people being physically attacked or harmed. Where do you draw the line is the question that we need to ask. Now, when you engage in that balancing exercise, you cannot forget the important fact that in a democracy, in a free society, there is an expectation that people will be allowed to engage in frank and free debate. And therefore, there are things that may be said in the course of that discourse, that debate, which may be unpleasant to a number of people, which may even be offensive to people. But there is no reason you should stop speech. So that aspect of the matter needs to be clearly borne in mind in the context of our discussion. Of course, there are risks, particularly in societies that are deeply divided, societies that are volatile, societies that are fragile. Why? Because people get excited too easily. So if you have a country where divisions are very deep, then one needs to exercise a degree of caution when engaging in speech that might be considered to be hate speech or verging on hate speech. What I'm trying to say is that there's a practical reason why there's need for caution in deeply divided, volatile, fragile societies. But this can happen also in stable societies during periods of crisis. As you know, there have been a few occasions in countries like the US where things have gone out of hand. Even though the US is generally speaking a very stable society. So if you look at even what happened a few weeks ago in Charlottesville, you will recognize that some sort of irresponsible utterance can spark violence or can exacerbate violence that already exists. So it's not only for fragile societies, but also for stable societies. But the risk is particularly stronger in fragile societies. And of course, one needs to keep in mind the impact of hate speech on minorities. Not only on minorities, because sometimes the target may be the majority community. But generally speaking, the tendency is to be particularly considerate of the position of minorities. There is a clear difference to be noted between incitement to violence and merely causing offense. And this is a point which sometimes is lost sight of. I have been telling you right from the beginning of these lectures that merely causing offense is not prohibited by the law. The law does give freedom for people in free societies to say things that may cause offense to other people. And I also told you there is no reason why you should engage in speech that causes offense to others. You have the right to cause offense, but you don't have to cause offense. Yeah.
So is there traditionally speaking, is there a traditional standard regarding hate speech when it comes to hate speech against the minority group?
No, there isn't. And for very good reason. Because not only is the point at which speech becomes unacceptable context specific, but it's also determined by historical and cultural factors, as I will show you when I give you some cases. So, for example, if you have a country that is homogeneous or largely homogeneous, and there's a very tiny minority which is not in any way excited or excitable, then the scope for frank speech will be higher than in a country where the homogeneity doesn't exist. And also, such minorities as there are very excitable, and they have a history of taking offense too soon. And there might be also a history of violence. So, there is one specific. Sorry?
There is a difference.
Well, first of all, there is no single document which says this is the standard.
Yeah, but like
in practice there is. In practice, that's what I'm trying to tell you. The international documents provide a uniform standard which is extremely general and extremely vague, which cannot be applied in the abstract. You will have to look at the facts of each case and the context in which a particular standard needs to be applied. And remember as well that international law in most countries does not apply directly. So international law simply provides standards. What each country has to do is to make laws. In other words, the parliament of each country would make laws that would translate those commitments, those international commitments, into domestic practice. And even those laws will, by the very nature of laws, be open to interpretation. So, causing offense, as I said, should not be taken as the standard for banning speech. A certain amount of freedom should be given to people to say things that cause offense to other people. And of course, from your point of view as media people, you need to be aware that you will be called upon to make judgments which are not easy to make. And most of the time you'll be asked to make judgments at very short notice. In other words, you don't have the luxury of time when it comes to making these decisions about when to carry a certain speech or when to abridge that speech or paraphrase that speech. And journalists are constantly facing this dilemma, and that is something which I'm sure you're all familiar with in the course of your work. Now, what are the reasons why you have hate speech laws? I'm just going to give you a few indicative points on that matter, on that subject matter. First of all, you have hate speech laws to prevent disorder, because no society likes disorder of a kind that is large scale, harmful, and generally speaking, deleterious to the population. Also, the avoidance of incitement to violence, not just in terms of generalized disorder, but particular incitements to violence. That also might be a factor for hate speech laws. And of course, the subject matter of the restrictions may vary from country to country. So, for example, in America, a particular sensitivity for hate speech laws would be race, because obviously that's the fault line in American society. But in India, it can be religion, it can be caste. So that varies from society to society. I've already told you about offense, so I'm going to skip that. Now, I was talking earlier about the need to do a balancing act, and also the need to recognize where the line should be drawn. between acceptable speech on the one hand and unacceptable speech on the other hand. And that's not an easy task to do, but generally speaking, and this is again subject to a number of qualifications, generally speaking, only those words which have a tendency to cause violence are criminalized. Now, it is easier said than done, because to interpret the phrase tendency to cause violence is not easy. You cannot do it in the abstract. You will have to have regard to the facts of each case. And quite frankly, the tendency to cause violence can differ from situation to situation. And therefore, in a sense, what I'm giving you is a principle that is a bit too general, a bit too vague. But that is, I think, still useful because, as I said, you do not draft a law on the basis that if someone feels offended, that amounts to hate speech. What you should do in your law is to recognize that the dividing line between acceptable speech and unacceptable speech is the tendency of the speech to cause violence. And of course, a judgment will have to be made about whether a particular situation is such as to meet that standard. And in the jurisprudence that you may look at from America, the phrase fighting words are often used. So in other words, it's only fighting words that can be penalized, that can be prohibited, not any other offensive or unpleasant words. So you have this quotation from a case that was decided in America, which gives an idea of how judges deal with these kinds of matters. So such words, by their very utterance, that is fighting words, by their very utterance, inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. An immediate breach of the peace, very, very important standard. It has been observed that such utterances are no essential part of any exposition of ideas and are of such slight social value as a step to truth, that any benefit that may be derived from them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. Again, you see a balancing interest here. That what you're talking about are not words that have any great intrinsic value. They are essentially words that are not that important, but the harm they cause may be such that they need to be penalized. That's a standard that is used in most countries. Now, I would suggest that there are a few general principles that can be noted in relation to the construing of hate speech restrictions or restrictions based on hate speech. First of all, those restrictions or the provisions that give rise to those restrictions need to be construed strictly. So if a law says certain kinds of speech can be banned on the grounds that they want to hate speech, then the provision of law that prescribes that standard will have to be interpreted very strictly, not to give it too expansive a construction, because if you did that, there is a risk that acceptable speech might also be caught in the net. That shouldn't happen. In a free society, in a democracy, as I said, there should be maximum freedom for people to express themselves. And in those circumstances, a strict construction of the statutes is necessary. Also, any sanctions that may accompany those provisions will have to be used sparingly. What it means is that you don't willy-nilly bump people into jail or start fining them unless it becomes really necessary. This is sort of what I spoke about in the context of contempt of court. Though of course, there's another considerations which apply. There should be maximum freedom given for expression. So within the limits that are permitted by the law, there should be more maximum freedom given for expression rather than for the curbing of expression. And of course, there's a need to avoid self-censorship. Now, this is something which is also extremely important, and I want to stress this point. What happens in many countries is people tend to take the easy way out. And why do they do that? Because they are afraid that if they stick their necks out, then they may be either accused of being too gung-ho, or they may actually be penalized retrospectively for not being cautious. So if you have a situation where you think there is going to be unrest on the part of a certain community as a result of something that has happened, how do you report it? You can either give your readers, listeners, viewers the unvarnished truth of what has happened. But the risk of doing that would be that violence may break out and other consequences may ensue. Or you can be very cautious and either not talk about it at all, or talk about it in such bland terms that, quite frankly, the message is diluted. Not an easy thing to apply in real life, but it is a factor worth keeping in mind. Self-censorship, unfortunately, has now become a major danger for journalism. It is sadly the case that in the West, this is becoming very widespread. And a major factor for it is political correctness. So you don't want to say anything that might offend a particular group of people. Usually, what may be referred to as preferred minorities. Minorities who are seen as deserving of protection, even from normal critical remarks. So self-censorship can be a major problem in this area. And of course, as I keep saying in relation to many other contexts, judicial protection is the ultimate backstop for all these problems. Even if a journalist makes a mistake, ultimately the arbiter of who is right and who is wrong will be the judge. There is no question about it. In any situation, you will have eventually to go to a judge. And if you do not have an impartial, well-resourced, competent, efficient judicial system, then you can forget about everything in society. The laws may look very good on paper. What is the point of having laws that look good on paper if the laws cannot be enforced impartially, competently, correctly? So the place for a robust and efficient working judiciary is something that can never be underestimated in any society. I would say that even if the law is faulty, to a certain extent, it can be corrected by a sensible judge. So the position of a judiciary becomes crucial. Okay, any questions up to now?
So I would like to draw your attention about the sections, if there are any in the IPC, number one. Number two, one has to be the aggrieved party to go to the legal remedies, or suppose something has been printed or any of the reader or viewer for that matter can file a case, or it has to be that to whom the injury has been made?
Well, it's easier to answer your second question first. The complaint can come from anywhere. It can be either somebody who has been injured, or it can be a member of the public, or more frequently, it is simply the police. Because the police have a duty to monitor these situations. So if the police come to the conclusion, at least a prima facie conclusion, that a certain law has been violated, a certain section of the Indian Penal Code has been violated, they have every right to take legal proceedings. Sometimes proceedings can be taken by a court, by judges themselves, as you know, suo motu action in respect of certain situations where, for example, the police has either deliberately ignored or has been inefficient. So it can come from anywhere. The answer to your first question is yes, there are specific provisions in the Indian Penal Code. I'm going to talk about them shortly. Okay. Any other questions? Can you use the mic? Because I want the others to hear.
not working.
It's not working. It's not functional. So we use this one. It's on. It's on. You just keep it closer to your mouth.
Sir, even if it is not hate speech, sometimes we get letters from election commissions during elections, and they ask that you have violated some rules.
Okay. You are quite right in raising the question. I'm going to come to that point shortly. It's quite important. Okay, it is there on the slides. Well, I'll come to that. Anything else? No? Okay, let's move on. Now, I'll first talk a little bit about international standards. One of you raised the question of international standards, and this will illustrate to you how general those standards are. But worth noting anyway, because these are meant to apply globally. So let's look at the standards there. First of all, the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a document that expands on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For those of you who don't know this, it is a document which has been produced under the auspices of the United Nations. So what does it say? Article 20 requires the prohibition that is a national law of advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred where it would lead to discrimination, hostility or violence. That is a standard prescribed by the ICCPR. Now, as you can see, the standard is quite general and quite vague. And you have to be careful not to read this standard too literally. There will have to be a certain threshold to be met for any law to penalize speech that may be seen as undesirable. Article 4 of CERD, which is the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, requires governments to make punishable the dissemination of ideas based on racial superiority. So, if there was in a given country a movement which proclaims that certain people are superior to others on the basis of race, then the convention requires the government to pass laws forbidding any such advocacy. Now, this of course would apply to situations like the one obtaining in America from time to time, who can propaganda about whites being superior to blacks, etc., etc. So that is the sort of standard that is being expected. And of course, some governments have disagreed with this proposition because they believe that freedom means freedom to say things that may be A, controversial, and B, crackpot ideas. So even if you disagree strongly with ideas of racial superiority, you should allow others to bring up those ideas because you can shoot them down. You can say, look, how idiotic you are, instead of suppressing such speech. That is one of the approaches taken by certain governments. Now, the UN Human Rights Committee, which is a body that has been set up to, if you like, police the ICCPR, has held that a Canadian law which punished the operator of a telephone service where a pre-recorded message of an anti-Semitic nature could be accessed was lawful. So what happened here was, in Canada, there was one of these chat lines. It's not exactly a chat line, it's more a line where you ring and you get pre-recorded messages. Some people get the thrill of listening to such messages. It could sometimes be of pornographic nature, but here the messages were anti-Semitic. So if you wanted to hear a rant against Jews, you dial that number, whatever it is. If you dial, they'll of course charge you for the call, and they'll charge you handsomely for the call, but you get the satisfaction of listening to somebody running down the Jews. That is the kind of service somebody offered, an enterprising entrepreneur offered that service. Now the question is, can the Canadian government ban such a service? And the UN Human Rights Committee held that the Canadian government could ban such a service. Why? Because it has an obligation under Article 4 of CERD not to encourage advocacy of racial superiority. So that's the sort of thing that is usually done when cases like this go to the UN Human Rights Committee. Okay, I'll give you a few examples of hate speech laws from different parts of the Commonwealth. The standard that is used in the UK is a fairly simple one. It says, any speech that is threatening, abusive, or insulting. Threatening, abusive, or insulting. Now, obviously, not a simple insult. It has to be of a certain standard, of a certain threshold. Now, that as long as it is aimed at or likely to cause racial, religious hatred, then it becomes punishable. And usually, this law is used with a degree of seriousness in terms of the threshold. So simply because somebody says something off the cuff that is threatening or that is insulting does not make it punishable. Threatening is a different matter, but insulting or abusive. There are lots of people who engage in abuse during debate. That is up to a point tolerated, depending on the seriousness, the context, etc. Yeah.
So, hate speech and speech in the public area is mutually exclusive categories, or can they overlap in certain cases?
Well, it depends on how you define hate speech. Generally speaking, a speech that is made which is likely to incite violence, as I said, would be considered hate speech, and therefore, or would be considered punishable hate speech. Now, you can have general hate speech, if you want to call it that, where you say things that are not pleasant, but which do not meet the threshold of incitement to violence. So, if your question is about speech in the course of public discussion, which may seem hateful, then the answer is such speech cannot invariably be banned or penalized. Okay, yeah.
So I think there is a relation between hate speech and defamation, whereas the hate speech legal actions can be brought in by anybody, but the defamation out of the hate speech will have to be brought in by the injured party.
Absolutely, but the issue about that is most of the time hate speech is an expression of opinion rather than an assertion of fact. Most of the time, not always, most of the time. For example, a person says all Jews deserve to be seen with a degree of suspicion. Now, that is an expression of opinion. That cannot amount to defamation. And it can also not amount to
defamation. You can file a defamation.
No, it cannot also amount to defamation because one of the principles I gave you when I told you about defamation was no group can take action in relation, or no member of a group can take action, no member of a big group can take action against defamation. So that is the kind of thing that happens. But sometimes hate speech can be the subject matter of defamation. If you are directing your hate speech against an individual, for example, now that can be both hate speech and defamation. It's possible. There can be an overlap. Okay, any other questions? No? Okay, let's move on. Now, I'll give you another example from the Criminal Code of Canada. So it's the equivalent of the Indian Penal Code in Canada. It says that inciting hatred against any identifiable group where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace is an offence. Now, let's see the wording there. Incitement to hatred against any identifiable group, not some general vague speech. Where such incitement is likely to lead to a breach of the peace. That qualification has to be very carefully considered. It is not simply speech that might incite to hatred, but it also has to lead to a breach of the peace. So again, you come back to the violence standard. Or willfully promoting hatred against any identifiable group by communicating statements other than in private conversations. Again, willfully, very important. Not in the course of debate, not accidentally, not negligently, etc., etc. And again, this will have to be considered beyond a certain threshold. But truth was allowed as a defense to any charge. It is not inconceivable. Suppose somebody says that a certain community is prone to certain behavior, so certain criminal behavior. If there is a risk that that statement might lead to violence, and in some societies it can lead to violence, then by the Canadian standard, the court would allow the person who made the speech to defend himself by saying, I have got statistics to show that this particular group is very prone to engaging in the kind of criminal behavior that I have said exists in that group. Now you could argue that by doing that he's only aggravating matters, but the law does allow people to say that. The reason being that unless you allow people to make such statements, there is not much prospect of reform coming about in that community. In other words, if you want to improve the behavior of the community, then sometimes you have to say harsh things about that community. So that's an approach taken. I suspect some people will disagree with this, but it is a reality that exists in many societies. In other words, you're maximizing the space for freedom of expression and only punishing such speech as is genuinely likely to lead to violence. And do remember that the law and order situation needs to be carefully controlled by the authorities. The police have a duty as well.
So, in such situations like the Canadian one, where truth is allowed as a defense, should it be seen the intention behind the speech, but as in if the speech was merely an academic sort of a statement, or a reformatory statement, or rather it was being used, even if it was the truth, it was being used as a method to explain.
Yes, that's why the word willfully. Very important. Willful means you assess the intention. Are you doing it deliberately? Or are you doing it as part of an exercise in social reform? Sometimes you may do it innocuously. You may even do it with a good intention of helping the community. So willful intention, willful behavior presupposes the existence of an intention.
So what do you think the position regarding this would be in India?
I'll come to a few Indian cases to tell you that the Indian courts also take a similar view. They don't go that far. They stop short slightly. But again, there is variation between courts. But the standard, generally speaking, is quite good in India. At least the standard set by Supreme Court judgments a few decades ago. Things are changing a little now. But by and large, the Supreme Court of India has taken a sensible view in these matters, as I will explain to you when I deal with the Indian cases. Any other questions? Okay, let's move. Now, we come straight to the Indian provisions then. You have the Penal Code, section 153A, which makes it an offence to promote or attempt to promote, whether by word, signs, or the visible representations, disharmony, feelings of enmity, hatred, or ill will between different villages, racial, language, or regional groups, or class or communities. Now, it's quite a long definition, but it has to be read with caution. Why? Because on the face of it, this section seems to be worded very loosely. For example, it says any speech that attempts to promote disharmony. I think that's a very low threshold, because you might sometimes say things which a particular group or community might consider disharmonious. That shouldn't make it a punishable offence. Or ill will. Now, ill will is a very low standard to prescribe. So, the law as it stands, prima facie looks loosely drawn. But the good news is, the courts have interpreted this provision very sensibly. So what the court says, you don't read it literally, but you read it in a manner that makes incitement to violence very much a part of the discussion. So if you do that, then I think this is an acceptable definition, though I personally think it can be reformed. The essence of this offence is malicious intention. This is what the courts have said, malicious intention, which can be inferred either from the offending words themselves or from the context. Sometimes the words themselves indicate a degree of malice which is inescapable, or you can assess the presence of malice from the context in which the words are uttered. and in ascertaining intention, the article in question must be read as a whole. This is a very important point. You know what happens sometimes? When you read newspaper articles, there will be parts of the article which carry phrases that are provocative, that are controversial, that almost make it sound as if the person who is writing the article has some sort of a grudge or ill will towards the group that he's commenting about. But on the other hand, there may be other passages in the same article which read differently. In other words, the writer of the article might be sympathetic to the people whom he's criticizing in parts of the article. And in those circumstances, it would be unfair if you only took out those passages where there is criticism and ignored the passages where the author is making a more sober point, almost by way of counterpoint to what he has said elsewhere. So you have to read the article as a whole, and you have to look at the context in which something has been said. And if you do that, then of course you will arrive at a better judgment about whether the article deserves to be either banned or the writer of the article deserves to be punished. So, what are the factors that need to be taken into account? To what class of readers was the article primarily intended? It's a very important consideration. Suppose you are writing an article which is in a mass circulation tabloid newspaper. The effect of that will be very different if you're writing an article in a journal that is targeted at intellectuals, at people of a certain intellectual disposition. And so, that to what class of readers or listeners you are targeting your speech matters a lot. What is the state of relations prevailing between the classes or communities concerned at the time of publication? So, if you're writing an article which is, say, critical of Muslims, if you wrote the article when the state of relations between Hindus and Muslims was reasonably stable, there was no friction, then that would be different from a situation where there was communal tension, there was a flare-up, and at that time you write those words, it will have a different impact. So the time at which you are aiming your remarks will also be quite important. What is the state of relations prevailing between the different communities? Were the offending words bona fide expressions of criticism? Very important, because this is where the intention part comes in. Are you trying to do something that is constructive? So an example might be, you are very concerned about the plight of divorced women, divorced Muslim women, because as you know, some of them have been abandoned by their husbands, they have not been given adequate maintenance, etc. Now, in those circumstances, if you were to write an article which is very critical of Islam, then it is different from a situation where you are predisposed towards condemning Islam. In other words, you have an anti-Islam agenda, and you use every occasion to run down that religion. That, of course, will not be treated as sympathetically as if you wrote an article in circumstances where your intention was that you did it in good faith. That's the point I'm trying to make. So if you wrote an article shortly after, say, if you did write an article shortly after the Shaban judgment, then that would be very different from writing an article more generally about how oppressive Islam is, etc., etc. So the whole idea of whether what you're doing is bona fide is very important. And were the words couched in temperate, dignified, and restrained language? I come back to this point again and again. You can make a very strong point without being abusive. You can write a strong article expressing your views in sober language, and the courts do have regard to that. If you write in language that is intemperate, there are greater chances of you being penalized. Yeah.
So even if the language was tempered,
Yep.
but the intention behind it still was to incite some sort of violence or something. In that situation, just because it did not end up inciting violence because it was tempered, what will be the result in that?
The court will be shrewd enough to look through the, if you like, the tactic of the writer, if that is what you have in mind. In other words, somebody who was not doing it with constructive intent, but who wanted to play it safe by using language that on the surface looks very restrained. The court will be able to see through it, generally.
So also what I'm asking is the consequence of the particular speech.
Yes.
How much is that accounted for? Like even if it's an extremely flary sort of a speech which really did intend to cause violence, but just by chance it ended up doing it.
The difficulty with answering that question is, in most cases, you don't wait to see the results of the speech because it may be too late. So, if, for example, you said, we'll see what the speech does. Does it flare up violence? But if violence flares up and 100 people are killed, then we'll take action. It doesn't work that way. The authorities, which includes the police as well as the judiciary, have to act on the basis of an informed judgment about whether the speech is likely to lead to violence. And that judgment can be flawed. Sometimes they make a mistake. But that is something which they are trained to do. So it is more before something happens than after. Of course, if you are talking about a situation where violence has already happened, then it's so much easier to deal with that speech, because then you can say this was clearly to be banned or to be penalized. Was the article in question a product of historical research intended for serious study? Now, you know that some people, some scholars, go through a lot of trouble to research particular religions, particular communities, particular castes, and come up with findings that may be very uncomfortable to members of those religions, castes, communities. Do you penalize them? The answer is no. Because if they did it genuinely as an act of historical scholarly research, then that will have to be given a degree of latitude. And most of the time, any such research is published in scholarly journals, not in mass circulation newspapers. So again, to some extent, the potential for danger is reduced. But you may sometimes have a summary of those findings being published in a tabloid newspaper. Now that can cause problems, but that does not take away from the fact that the person who wrote the article did it in good faith and with a higher purpose in mind, which is scholarly research. So that's again an important factor which the courts will have regard to. Were the words in question aimed at a well-defined and readily ascertainable group having some permanence or stability and sufficiently numerous and widespread to be designated as a class of people? This is also important because sometimes you write an article which is very diffuse. You cannot say it's written about a particular group that is likely to be affected. In those circumstances, it will be harsh if action was taken against the writer, and so there has to be an identifiable group that might be excited or incited to taking the law into its own hands. It's important to note that Section 153A does not apply to a law, to a law and order problem arising from comments offered or criticism made about a historical figure which may have offended a group of people. Again, another very important qualification that the Supreme Court has introduced in relation to the interpretation of Article 153A. Although, of course, there have been many occasions in India where a historical figure has been the focal point for violence of a disorder, and I may have occasion to give one of the cases. I'll tell you, for example, you may have heard about this incident involving Professor James Lang, who wrote an article, wrote a book on Shivaji, and that led to a lot of problems. In fact, a whole Research Institute was ransacked as a result of the publication of that book. So, although this principle is quite useful, it has not always been respected. There's then 153B of the Penal Code, which makes it an offence to publish imputations or assertions which imply that any class of persons cannot, by being members of that group, bear true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India or uphold the sovereignty or integrity of India. A typical crude example of this will be to say that if you are a Muslim, you are unlikely to be loyal to India, that your loyalty lies to Pakistan. That sort of thing. That is what is hit by this particular section. Or to suggest that any such class of person should be denied or deprived of their rights as citizens of India. But do remember, this applies only to words that are uttered directed at a class of people, a group of people, not individuals. So, if you wrote an article with evidence which said that a particular person seems to be more loyal to Pakistan than to India, and if it is a well-researched article, that will not be hit by 153B. Because what you're saying is you're not tarring a whole community with the same brush. You are specifically directing your criticism against a particular person. But of course, remember, you have to have evidence to back up what you're saying, or to cause, or to be likely to cause disharmony or feelings of enmity, hatred, or ill will between members of such class and others. Now, this is slightly more controversial, because the way it's worded may make it feel that you can apply it in any situation where somebody says something bad about a community and that community feels ill will towards the other community, then it becomes an issue. It's not like that. Again, a certain threshold has to be met. It has to be fairly serious for an offence to be made out. 295A is another provision which often comes into the picture when you're dealing with hate speech or potential hate speech. This makes it an offence to commit deliberate or malicious acts intended to outrage the religious feelings of any class of people by insulting its religious or religious beliefs. And again, you have to have regard to malicious intent. This can be inferred from the circumstances surrounding the publication of the offending words. So, rational criticism, which is made in good faith, even if it tends to wound the feelings of some followers of a particular religion, is not punishable. Very important to remember this. Especially the object of criticism is to facilitate social reform by administering a shock to the followers of that religion. An example might be if you write an article condemning in very strong terms certain practices that are adopted under Sharia law. So, chopping off the hands of somebody who has stolen a loaf of bread, or stoning somebody to death for adultery. Now, this is likely to wound the feelings of some members of the Muslim community. But that doesn't make it an offense. If you do it sincerely and if your intention is to reform society, because remember, human rights laws also require the banishment of cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment and punishment. So you have on the one hand a law which ostensibly penalizes such speech. On the other hand, you have a principle of international law which says you should do everything possible to remove such barbaric practices. So stoning to death for adultery, for example. So those sort of articles will be seen as acceptable, even if they tend to wound the feelings of members of a certain community. And only speech that amounts to an aggravated form of insult and has a tendency to cause a breach of public order is punishable. Again, you can see the standard being brought in, breach of public order, violence that is. It's not so much the matter of discourse as its manner that is often crucial in determining whether an offence has been committed. You can say the same thing differently and get away with it. That's the point that is being made by the Supreme Court. The word should therefore be such that it regarded by any reasonable person. Now you see the standard that's being set as grossly offensive, provocative, and maliciously, deliberately intended to outrage the feelings of any class of citizens. You can see the heavy qualifications that are placed on the application of Section 295A of the Penal Code. In other words, you don't use this section lightly. There are so many things that you have to look at before you can make out an offence under section 295A. Very quickly, one indicative case, which is, I thought, topical here. It's a Kolkata case. Charges were made under section 295A against the editor of the Statesman and its publisher when the newspaper reprinted an article published in the Independent London, which was essentially a very strongly worded critique of Islam as practiced in certain jurisdictions. And the writer of the article was incidentally a very left-wing journalist from the Guardian newspaper. Now, when the article was reprinted in the Statesman here in Calcutta, there were many street protests, and there was a blockade of the paper's headquarters in Calcutta. Chowringhee Square was taken over by these protesters. Controversially, the editor and the publisher were arrested by the police under Article 295A for bringing about ill will, hatred, etc. against a particular community. But of course, they were released on bail. I honestly do not know the outcome of this case. I had occasion to talk about this case to the editor some years ago, and he said the case was still pending. And it's impossible to predict how long it will take for the case to be heard. Sometimes these cases just disappear without any verdict being given. So I don't know. In fact, I might ask one of you to tell me.
It's not being heard, but it's still pending.
It is pending. Right.
Pending for a long time.
Of course.
Many of us have our contempt cases, but for ages and ages.
Of course. That is an unavoidable feature of litigation in India or criminal cases in India, prosecutions in India. So at least I'm glad to be told that the case has not either been dismissed with any consequences for the parties involved, or that it has disappeared off the radar. In other words, it's still pending, and who knows when it's going to be heard. Now, there's the other interesting case was about the OIC brothers. There are quite a few cases, but one in particular I wanted to talk about. Do you remember a few years ago, maybe a couple of years ago, one of the OIC brothers made a rather astounding statement, I think in a public speech, and he said something like, all we want is for the law enforcement authorities, that is the police and others, to stop acting or stop performing their duties for 15 minutes, and we'll see what happens. Now that, according to me, is a very grave threat. Because what's the implication of that? Basically, you don't allow the law enforcement authorities to control order, and you allow us to take the law into our own hands. Completely unacceptable in any law, any society that believes in the rule of law. As far as I know, no action has been taken, but I may be wrong. You may be able to correct me. But that was a striking example of speech that I think should have been penalized under Article 295A, or possibly one of the other sections of the penal code. So there we are. Now, there's also 298 of the penal code, which makes it illegal for anyone with deliberate intention of wounding the religious feelings of another person to utter words or make sounds or gestures in the hearing or sight of that other person, or to place any offensive object in the sight of such person. Now, offensive object, you know of those cases that happen from time to time where a pig's carcass is left outside a mosque, or a cow's carcass is left outside a temple. Those are the sort of things that can be brought under this section. It should be proved that the words complain of oneself, not in the heat of debate, but with premeditation. It applies to words as well, not just objects.
No.
Yep.
What if it's the state that is the perpetrator of such phrases or such inappropriate activities?
What is
What
the
if
state?
it's the state? I mean, what if it's the government that promotes such insightful activity? Then what happens?
Okay, the short answer to the question is it doesn't make a difference who does it, but a longer answer will have to then consider what do you mean by the state, because the state ultimately means individuals. So what do you mean by the state?
Maybe Chief
No,
Minister.
let's hear what she said.
I mean the government.
No, don't say government. The government is not a mechanical thing.
Okay, yeah, so say for instance the Chief Minister
Right.
of the state.
Yep.
If he and his party members,
Yep.
they actively they actively undertake activities or they have statements in these, say, open grounds that actually incite violence, and these are based on religious and caste, like which offend religions and caste also. In that case, what happens?
They are just as amenable to prosecution as people who don't hold government positions. That's the clear answer to that question. There cannot be any exception made simply because somebody happens to be the chief minister or holds any other position in government. Okay, let's move on. Sorry, 505. This is a provision which makes it an offence to circulate any statement or report that contains a rumour or alarming news intended to create or promote feelings of enmity, hatred, ill will, etc. between different religious, racial, linguistic groups, etc. Now, this is a slightly curious provision. What it means is, if you as a journalist were to reproduce a rumour which has the effect of inciting ill will, hatred, etc. between religious groups, then you can be held liable for the accountable for that kind of publication. But of course, exceptions are made for statements, rumors, or reports which are made by anyone who having reasonable grounds to believe them to be true, makes or publishes them in good faith. But so, for example, if you're reproducing the speech of somebody made at a press conference responsibly, then of course you will have protection under qualified privilege. Now, I'll give you an example of how this provision has sometimes been misused. This is the case of Mr. Pasricha and a newspaper called the Sunday Observer, which is now defunct. It's a newspaper which was founded and edited by Vinod Mehta, who also, as you know, is no more. Now, all this happened in Bombay. Mr. Pasricha, I don't know if any of you know or have heard of him, he used to be a very high-profile police commissioner, and he made his mark in particular in Bombay by being the originator of large-scale reforms concerning traffic movement in Bombay. So that was his claim to fame. Now, as his name suggests, he is a Sikh. What happened at that time? This is a case going back to the late 80s. What happened at the time was that there was the Khalistan agitation going on, and there was a rumor which was reproduced by the Sunday Observer newspaper, which said that Mr. Pasricha had met certain people who were known to be Khalistani supporters. Obviously, he had met them in his personal capacity, not as police commissioner. When this item appeared in the Sunday Observer, the police department filed a case against the newspaper editor, publisher, etc. under Article 505 of the Penal Code, on the grounds that what was published amounted to a rumor or alarming news which was intended to create or promote feelings of enmity, hatred, ill will, etc. between Sikhs and other Indian communities. Remember, this is a criminal case filed against the editor, etc. And if the prosecution had succeeded, they would probably have been sent to jail. Now, do you think a case like that should have been filed? Was there any basis for the prosecution?
Whether he had actually met?
Let us assume he has met.
fact of the matter, if he had met and he happens to be the police commissioner or deputy
No.
commissioner traffic?
He
or-
did not meet, even if he met them, he did not meet them as police commissioner. He met them, if he met them in his personal capacity.
Even sir, if he
Public
meets as a
service.
citizen, because I think at that point of time, it was not an overground organization. It was declared as UG. So any government servant meeting the UG, or for that matter, any citizen having some link with the UG could be filed with this case. But in case of journalists, the journalists go and take the interviews of the so-called UGs. They are not there, the covert, the overground outfits, but even the UG's interviews are published every time.
Incidentally, the article was not based on any interview at all. It was just relaying gossip, relaying rumors, saying the grapevine is full of news that Mr. Pasricha has been meeting people who are involved in the pro-Khalistan movement. That's what it was. So, you wanted to say something?
No. What is it? I mean, he's a public servant and a police commissioner. If he's meeting an organization that is a threat to
He
internal
was
security.
not meeting an organization either.
Some people were.
He was meeting some people who are alleged to be supporting the Khalistani movement.
It seemed like the Calcutta police commissioner today meets some Maoist sympathizers.
Yeah.
Even in his personal capacity. That is obviously a news story.
Okay.
You are the police commissioner.
Okay, what then I want to know is, was the prosecution justified?
So to an extent it depends on the grounds he had to believe this particular story. Because
Who had grounds to believe this story? Mr. Pasricha?
No,
The
the
editor.
who published it,
Yeah,
the
okay.
editor.
Yeah.
So if he had like reasonable enough grounds, then it's of course to some extent in public interest that government servant is meeting separatist
Yeah.
elements.
Yeah.
However, if it's just like, I mean, of course not a figment of their imagination, but
Yeah.
if it's not justified enough, then of course there would be some ground for prosecution.
Okay. Right. Any other thoughts? I'm surprised that you missed one very important point here. Okay, what is the alleged harm that is being confronted? State of relations between communities. Is what you saying? Yeah. Do you think that a news report of that sort is likely to lead to hatred, ill will between communities of such a gravity that there will be, for example, public disorder?
I don't think the intention was to create any such.
Right.
Because
Sometimes intention is not necessary. Sometimes. So even if you put intention to one side,
It was absolutely personal in nature and no ramifications over forthcoming disturbance of public order or outrage or breach of peace or riot or whatever it is.
Therefore-
For which
therefore,
there is no founding of filing this case under
Right.
505. He could
Okay.
have, for false information, he could have sent a rejoinder, could have sent a clarification, could have sent a defamation that it is not true or he met in his personal capacity, etc., whatever it is, or he could have kept quiet.
the last point that you made was what was constantly urged by people who are shocked by this prosecution. Namely, okay, sometimes rumors like this can cause problems. Problems in the sense that they can cause damage. The damage would be to Mr. Pasricha's reputation, not ill will between groups. Mr. Pasricha's reputation could have been seriously damaged if it was alleged falsely that he met with pro-Khalistani elements. So if he was sure that he did not meet any such people, very easy, go and file a defamation case and you will win, which he did not do. Instead, he or his people used the easy way out and made the state launch a prosecution. Either because Mr. Pasricha would have found it expensive to launch a defamation case, and and this is the easy way of doing it. It's a bit like I was telling you earlier, sometimes judges use the law of contempt instead of the law of defamation. Their office protects them from certain consequences. So the overwhelming view was that this prosecution was totally unjustified, that Section 505 was not intended to cover cases like this. It had to be much more serious, much more substantial. And in those circumstances, there was a protest against the prosecution, although the prosecution continued for a while, and then quietly the government withdrew the case because they realized they didn't have a leg to stand on. If the case had been heard, the case would have been dismissed. So to save face, they withdrew the prosecution. So this was an example of potential misuse of Section 505.
Sir, just a clarification, these are the sections which are from IPC, but it seems to be civil in nature, that kind of a damage or kind of a thing. But if suppose one has to do it, he has to file an FIR, because all cases will have to be state versus. Suppose I feel that there is a hatred has been generated, and I'll have to go and file an FIR with the police. I cannot go and take remedy of IPC through any civil court.
Either that or the police themselves
Yeah.
can initiate action.
If they don't, then I have to file an FIR.
Yeah.
And then it depends on the police to take cognizance on that FIR, or they will keep it as a DD.
Absolutely. So there are procedural issues as well. But anyway, in this case, they decide to go ahead with the prosecution.
No, I am not referring to this case, sir. Suppose something has happened for hate speech, and then I go and file a GD, and that cannot be taken as FIR, and prosecution cannot be started also. So it is not on the judiciary, it is to the policing system that my remedy can be covered also.
The first onus is on the prosecuting authority, which is in India the police. Okay? Only if the prosecuting authority makes a mistake will
Then I
that
go to the magistrate.
mistake be dealt with by the judiciary. Because the judiciary at that point can say, you have no business to file this case at all, case dismissed. Can happen. Okay? Right, let's move on. There's a provision in the Criminal Procedure Code, Section 95, which gives the government the power to forfeit copies of any newspaper, book or publication. It's relevant to media, which appears to contain matter that is likely to promote enmity between different racial, etc. groups, or which is prejudicial to national integration. This is used usually to seize copies of books and newspapers they don't like. And the example I'm given there is satanic verses. India was the first country in the world to ban the satanic verses book, and copies of the book were, of course, confiscated under Section 95 of the Criminal Procedure Code. Cinematograph Act is also relevant because we're talking about the media in general, not just newspaper journalists. You know that censorship of films is allowed, and visuals or words contemptuous of racial, religious, other groups, or which promote communal attitudes can be excised. Now, there is some difficulty with the last bit, promote communal attitudes. I think it's too widely worded, because quite frankly, freedom of expression, if it means anything, means a person's right to express views which may be communal. But if it doesn't incite people to violence, there is every reason why such views should be allowed to be aired. The answer to bigotry is for those views to be countered by someone else. So if one filmmaker says something disparaging about a certain community, then the way you deal with it is allow a dozen others to attack the man through their work and to show that his view is utterly misplaced, is even bigoted. You don't censor the person. You don't say, we won't allow you to say anything of that nature. As long as I said, it does not cross the line into inciting violence. If you say something communal and it incites violence, that is unacceptable. But if you simply say something about a community, then that, I think, in a democracy should be allowed. And the good news is that there have been a number of cases which have gone to the courts where this kind of censorship has been struck down, and I'll talk about them shortly. Now, other statutes which are relevant to hate speech in India are the Cable Television Networks Act, the Cinematograph Act, to which I've already referred, the Information Technology Act, Section 69, not 66A, 69, also contains a prohibition against spread of hate speech. The Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act also is something that does not allow you to say certain things which amount to hate speech. And then, of course, the Press Council of India has published what are called norms of journalistic conduct, which reinforce that message about not allowing any kind of what may be called hate speech. Now, I want to talk about cases. I've given you an idea of the kind of statutes that exist. Let's talk a little bit about cases. So, the first thing, of course, and this answers a question which somebody asked me in the first day or two. I suspect the person is probably not in this room, but I'll answer the question anyway. It is about the risks of live broadcast. I'm sure those of you who work in television will know this. Massive risk with a live broadcast. You never know because you can't predict in advance what one of the participants is going to say. And what can you do? You can, up to a point, deal with it by issuing a correction or an apology afterwards. You can also do what many channels around the world do, and that is have a time delay between the actual discussion and the telecasting of it. And the time delay will usually be very short, 2 minutes or something like that, during which time it is possible for an alert editor to cut something that has been said that is unacceptable. Anyway, in spite of that, it is difficult. And I'll illustrate that with a case. Sorry, yes, you go ahead.
How much were disclaimers before these shows come?
Very little. They come to the extent that if any action is taken, the punishment will be reduced, the amount of damages awarded may be reduced, but they don't absolve you of liability. Okay. Now let's take the case of Jersild and the state and Denmark. What happened here was there was a live discussion on TV, on Danish TV, on the very sensitive subject of immigration. You know that Denmark generally is a homogeneous society, although they have now been getting a few immigrants. And this has become a point of friction. This became a point of friction even 10, 20 years ago. So there was a discussion on TV. It was anchored by a young man who got together people of diverse views, genuinely diverse views. So some people were pro-immigration, some were very anti-immigration. Inevitably there will be sparks flying. But that's the nature of public debate. You have to have a robust discussion, as long as you don't incite people to violence. So the discussion started, and some of the participants began trading barbs in a manner that was that crossed the line from acceptable to unacceptable speech. At which point the poor anchor did his best to calm down people and said, for God's sake, let us have a more sober debate and let's not engage in this kind of provocative talk, etc., etc. He failed. So a lot of things were said which should not have been said, which amounted to incitement to violence. The issue then was, under Danish law, the onus was on the television company. They should not have allowed such a discussion at all. So the TV company was very heavily fined for this program. The TV company was not happy because they thought they did everything reasonable to defuse the situation, yet here they were being asked to pay this huge amount of fine. So they went to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, because Denmark is like many other European countries, part of the European Convention on Human Rights, they could go to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And the European Court gave a judgment which is quite sensible. It says that there are limits to what you can do during a live discussion. Obviously, before you decide on a live discussion, you have to make a judgment whether this is a topic where things can go out of control. If it is, then try to have it as a pre-recorded program. Don't engage in live discussion. But if you think you can still manage it, do it as best you can. And also take the minimum precautions that you normally take. If, for example, in choosing the panelists, you don't get somebody rabid who is likely to almost definitely make a statement that crosses the line. And you have a good, robust anchor who has control over the proceedings, etc., etc. But in spite of that, it may not happen. So in any case, the verdict of the European Court of Human Rights was that Danish law on this occasion was too harsh on the TV company. This is something which, of course, will arise in many other jurisdictions. And to some extent, the result may be different in different jurisdictions. There have been occasions, as you probably know, where discussions have resulted in people involved, in the participants, either throwing water against each other or much worse, other objects in the TV studio, and on rare occasions, actual fisticuffs. So one fellow going bashing up the other chap. Happens. If it does, because it gives the channel a very, very bad name, but apart from that, it can also be a violation of national laws. So live interviews and live broadcasts, there are huge dangers. Now, risks in coverage of election speeches. I want to now come to what you've been asking for the last 2 or 3 days. So here's your answer. There are huge problems. You know that during election times, there is a tendency on the part of people to say things that they may not say during normal times, because they obviously want to win votes. And they go to any lengths, sometimes attacking their opponents in language that is not acceptable. What is the role of journalists? Now, you expect politicians to behave in that way, but what about your role? What do you do? On the one hand, you have a duty to report election speeches as widely as possible, because that is part of your duty to educate the people about the issues in the forthcoming election. And you can't shirk that responsibility, so it's your duty to do that. On the other hand, if you did something that led to large-scale violence, then you of course can't shirk responsibility for that. So you are in a dilemma, and you have to make a very fine judgment when you come across these kinds of, for example, political rallies. There's people suddenly, again, it's a little like a live broadcast. You can't predict in advance what somebody is going to say. You can up to a point, but beyond that you can't. So when that happens, what do you do? It's particularly difficult for television journalists, because you would be covering the speech, and sometimes you would be covering it live. But even if it's not live, what do you do when it comes to a news bulletin? You can either reproduce the speech as it is to show how rabid a person was, and in a sense educate the people against such politicians, or you can summarize or paraphrase what the fellow said without using the same language. And normally the second is preferred by responsible broadcasters, by responsible journalists. So you want to convey to the audience that somebody said something totally unacceptable in society, but you don't use the same words, so that there's no risk of violence. That would probably be the solution to such situations. Yes. You have further questions to ask. I'm more than happy to answer them now.
Sometimes it happens that we go for normal good, and as the views of other political parties has not been published, so election commission may say that in this you have crossed the line, and it may be against the model code of conduct, or they may step us saying that it's paid news.
Okay. When you say they, who do you mean?
Election commission.
Okay, I am not very familiar with the model code of conduct. Okay, can someone tell me, is there a requirement under the model code of conduct for every media outlet to be balanced in the coverage of election news?
Fair and balanced. Actually, what happens is under the Election Commission of India, in each district there is an MCIC committee formed. There's mass communication, and what they call it, the committee is formed, and by the police, each speech of important political leaders are videographed, number one, so that it can be used as an evidence. And number two, the coverage will have to be fair and balanced. If it is not, there can be complaints by the opposite political party, then the committee goes through, and the balance has to be over a period of time. Not that on a particular day. On a particular day, one very important leader of a particular party comes here and addresses, so obviously his speech is highlighted. The other day, the other political party's main leader comes and his speech is highlighted. So over a period of time, it has to be fair and balanced, and it is generally seen, but the paid news complaints are slightly different in case of constituency reviews and constituency profiles, when we are saying that how many candidates are there, and if it is found that there are 3 formidable candidates, and I am not making any mention of the other 2, and I am only saying the sitting one, he has done so much, and so good things and he's going to win, and there is a support base from this side, support base from that side. So these are the articles which are generally coming under paid news.
Okay, so let's separate the two. Let's deal with this issue of fair and balanced reporting of election rallies or meetings, right? Does that requirement of fair and balanced reporting apply to private channels as well?
Yes.
Not only state channels, right? I must confess I'm very surprised at such a stipulation, because
But generally, as far as the coverages are concerned, the Election Commission is not bothered. The Election Commission is bothered about blackouting the other candidates in case of a constituency review.
okay, whatever it is, so therefore to some extent what you're saying doesn't appear to be the case. But anyway, on a broader principle, I must confess I'm very surprised at this mandatory requirement which extends to private channels that they should have fair and balanced coverage. Now, I can understand fair. I will have some difficulty with the word balanced, because it is very difficult to achieve balance, particularly a scientific balance between all parties involved in an election campaign. Almost impossible, because sometimes candidates are not even interested in putting their views forward. Can you compel them? Can you go and say, look, because I have to achieve balance, now speak for 5 minutes? No way. I think this is rubbish, and quite frankly, it is vulnerable, in my opinion, to a constitutional challenge, because it also infringes on freedom of expression. Why can't it be that a particular channel is totally biased in favor of a particular party or a particular candidate? The answer is, as I always said, let there be 20 other channels which are against that particular party or that particular candidate. That is a better way to deal with these matters in a democracy, in a free society. You don't say we'll compel everybody to give equal time to everyone, or even equitable time to everyone. But there is an exception which I accept, and that is, for example, when it comes to election broadcasts. Every party, every major party is given free time on television to make their election broadcasts. There has to be a degree of balance and equity. Even there, it won't be. I would hesitate to use the word balance, because balance shows a degree of equivalence. It can't be like that, because the major parties will obviously get more time, more airtime than the minor parties. It is inevitable. And that in most countries there's a formula used to determine who gets what, because whatever you've achieved in the previous election.
by the Election Commission of India.
Yeah, that's not a
broadcast is
problem.
only on the public service broadcaster.
Yeah,
not on private.
so therefore I can't see any problems with that. What I do have difficulty with this is this idea of balance when it comes to covering speeches, etc. In practice, I personally think it is very difficult to work it out. But anyway, if that is the case, so be it. Yeah.
On this question of balance, now there are news channels or there are television channels which are owned by certain people who have a political background.
Correct, and a political affiliation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially down south, there are distinct political identities to certain channels.
Yeah.
Now, would you expect such channels to maintain this balance?
Absolutely not. In fact, it would be a violation of their freedom of expression.
Exactly.
They have been set up explicitly to represent a certain viewpoint.
Precisely.
As long as that viewpoint does not offend any other laws, for example, incitement to violence, etc., they should be allowed to espouse their very biased viewpoint. And as I said, the answer to bias will be then to allow others to set up to counter what these people are saying. And that happens, I believe, in India, because there are usually people who set up rival channels to espouse a viewpoint that is unrepresented. So I can't see any problems. So the answer to your question is quite complex.
So perhaps a counter argument to this point regarding not enforcing some sort of a balancing coverage would possibly be that the people who are subscribing to your channel, irrespective of what their viewpoint be and what their reason for subscribing to that channel might be, they are perhaps in ignorance of what your viewpoints are, because in news channels you don't have a disclaimer of some sort that we represent the viewpoints of a particular political party, etc. So in that sort of situation, the message that you're propagating will be taken as fact rather than some sort of a biased propaganda, which it is.
Yeah.
So
I can't buy that argument, because if you do that, you're very naive. Look, if you watch a particular channel which repeatedly and without exception keeps parroting a certain line, then you'd be extremely naive to think that this is an unbiased, objective channel. Come on, it doesn't work that way. What you then do is you've got something called a remote control. You go to other channels and see what happens.
It's not, here the stakeholder is not your educated open population, right? It's about people who will possibly subscribe to that particular point of view if it's repeated often enough. So, do you believe that regarding the societal context of India at least, where certain people are unfortunately ignorant about the socio-political realities, in those situations, do you not think that some sort of a balance should possibly be enforced by a neutral regulator?
No, I don't at all. Because, look, you don't need to be literate to understand this. I can understand an issue of literacy. For example, many countries consider it very odd that Indian voters have to choose symbols. This is unheard of in most countries. What you have is just the name of the candidate. Now there is a reason for that, because there is a degree of illiteracy which doesn't allow people to read names, etc. I make allowance for that. But for being able to understand the bias on TV during elections, you don't need to be literate. And secondly, there are countervailing forces. People will tell you, go to this channel if you want to hear views in favor of X party. Go to another channel. Community says that. This is something which I think should be given more credit than is being given in India. People are not so dumb, they're not so foolish as to not recognize something which is blatant propaganda for a particular party. So, and in the long run, I think it is not good for democracy if you start having this very heavy regulation in relation to election broadcasts. So I still think that it is wrong to compel somebody to say something which they do not wish to say in this respect. There are certain other respects, for example, anti-smoking messages. I can understand to a point. Ultimately, we are talking about must-carry provisions. But that is different from what we are talking about here. Okay, so I don't think it is fair to require channels to maintain what is called balance.
Sir, maintaining this sort of artificial balance also would further obscure where the loyalties of the channel lie. The whole point of the debate is to make people more aware about different political actors and all the plans that they have to bring on board. The fact that you sort of put this artificial obligation on channels to air views from both ways sort of obscures the political realities that they are sort of, there is some propaganda behind them as well. So I don't know how much.
It's very difficult. Can you imagine you are so strongly committed to party X to be told you also should speak favorably about party Y? It never happens. Humans are not built like that.
Yes, I am diverting the subject. Most of the time we are being defensive in covering riot-like situation, particularly communal riots. So there are risk of being sued. What is your take on media covering communal?
No, sorry, risks of being sued by whom?
No, we hardly covered the riot situation.
Right.
As of now, serious riot is happening in a district.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't see the reports in any of the
No,
newspapers
so
or any
who
of
was
the news.
threatening to sue?
Maybe the public authority or some aggrieved person.
To sue for not reporting something.
No, for reporting
Which might incite violence. Which might incite.
Okay. Then we are not straying from the topic at all. On the contrary, you are getting closer to the topic. We slightly strayed from the topic when you are talking about election commission, model code, and all that. But you are actually bringing it back. Yeah, okay. So, in a sense, prosecuted. You are being prosecuted for
Inciting
violence. Yeah, okay. So, what is your question?
how we should cover it?
Okay, that is what I've been talking about all along. You will have to make a judgment about whether you cover something raw. For example, raw violence, somebody stabbing another person. Normally that is not done by any broadcaster, mainly for reasons of ethics, but also for reasons of law. Because if you look at the ethical codes, it says very clearly no gory scenes to be telecast. Okay, so what you will do is you will show, for example, you will show the after effects of violence. Lots of shops being vandalized, etc., etc. You don't show the actual killing or shooting or whatever, or corpses. So that's one thing. The other is to summarize or paraphrase what a politician says. So if he says something nasty, something so outrageous that to telecast it live or raw will end up in violence, then you don't do that. You summarize it and you say X said things which are totally unacceptable in an orderly society, and the thrust of his remarks were dash 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 dash. But even there you have to be careful, because I notice sometimes people becoming too cautious. The difficulty with being too cautious is you do it with good intention, I don't deny that. The difficulty is you don't give the reader, listener, viewer a correct picture. You confuse them. I even have a fundamental objection with this remarkable shyness on the part of Indian journalists to say there was a clash today between Hindus and Muslims.
Yes.
Between one community and another. Come on. For the people who are intelligent, you are insulting their intelligence. And for the others, you are not educating them. What is wrong in saying that there was a clash between Hindus and Muslims? I know that the argument is some Hindus will feel offended, some Muslims will feel offended. You can't suppress the truth like that. At the end of the day, they will also find out. If somebody is very keen to find out, they will find out. And now with the internet, it becomes even easier. So rather than do that, why not have an open description of what happened, without in any way inciting anything. So again, that's a personal viewpoint. I may be completely wrong. I'm more than happy to listen to this.
Just let us share what is the ground reality.
Yeah.
For us, it's a big no-no. It's a big no, whether it's a private, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a television channel, whether you are showing or quoting a speech. It's a big no-no. There are smaller incidents which take place, but it never see the light in the media. Yes, exactly. You have said that through the internet and WhatsApp, there are a lot of messages go viral, but not in mainstream media.
Yeah. Sorry,
I'm saying unless it becomes a proportion of the result, right?
Yes.
Then obviously. And
I
also,
still think,
most
you
of
know,
the times there's a request from the government
yeah.
to the journalists not to cover, not to write.
No, I know. That's what I'm criticizing. Now, what I'm saying is, I'm very aware of the nature of the problem. I'm simply saying that as part of becoming more mature as a society, these rules should be re-examined. That's all. I'm not saying you do it radically. It's simply that don't take it as the gospel truth simply because something has been happening for so many years, or that it has come from the government. A lot of the time what comes from the government is not healthy. I'm not saying always, sometimes. At least try to have a debate, an open and frank debate in forums like this. Closed door forums, so there's no risk of further violence because of this. Yeah.
More so, sir, am I allowed to?
Yeah, of course you are.
Sir, more so what ma'am you have said at the end, it's more a self-restraint, number one. Number two, I am not aware, I'm sorry about any central government instructions, there might be, but Press Council of India has a code of ethics, how to deal with riots like that specifically. But somehow or other, I don't know in the other parts of our country, here, we see that even small incidents also, you will never get to see them in any of the newspapers. It's very difficult to answer. I mean, this is something which we are trained to follow, and it's for us. That's why I initiated the role. It's a big no-no for all of us.
Okay, a couple of cases. There's the one from the Netherlands where an author was convicted for a tract which strongly criticized immigrant workers and called for a homogeneous society. And this conviction was held to be legal. Now, what is happening here is that the person who wrote that booklet strongly criticized immigrant workers. I personally think this is a prosecution too far, because for a country like the Netherlands, which is otherwise extremely free, for people not to have the freedom to say that immigration is not to be encouraged on a large scale is wrong. Even if they're wrong, it's possible that the viewpoint is wrong. But unless you have a debate, how are you going to determine public policy? But the difficulty here is we have a problem in the West, and our problem is political correctness. Nowadays, it's impossible in the West to say anything against immigrants. And that unfortunately has a habit of allowing a lot of right-wing groups to surface, which otherwise would not have happened. So one needs to be careful, in censoring views like this. Again, I would say, if this person was wrong in expressing his view, why don't other people attack him on print and say, that look, you are completely misguided, that these are the benefits of immigration, and therefore immigration should be encouraged. What is the harm in having a healthy debate? That is the kind of approach that many people would take. But anyway, this conviction was held to be legal. Now take another example from Australia, a completely different part of the world, where there was a radio chat show, radio talkback show. You know how it is. Those things can be very robust in terms of the exchanges. So the host, who was quite a belligerent fellow, was telling to an Aboriginal caller from the Aboriginal community, which is like scheduled caste. He was saying, I'll tell you about Stuart. Stuart is the name of the chap who was calling in from the Aboriginal community. So he said, I'll tell you about Stuart. You are so typical of many of your race. You are belligerent, you are a bully, you are a loudmouth, you are ill-informed, you are plain bloody stupid. Right? Now, generally speaking, language like this is very common with radio talkback shows. So don't be shocked by the language. Completely normal. But there is a problem here. And what is that?
Race.
Yeah, what this fellow could have done to avoid a legal difficulty is, he should not have said, you are so typical of so many of your race. He should simply have said, Stuart, you are belligerent, you are a bully, you are a loudmouth, etc., etc. All of this would be totally acceptable, because that's a level of debate that is considered to be well within the law in countries like Australia. But the moment you bring in race, what you're trying to do is to stereotype all Aboriginals by saying all of you are like that.
So even we do not bring in race in India, generally this is not the type of words.
No, correct, absolutely. But that is a matter of ethics. So it's not law, it is ethics. And ethics to a large extent would be dependent on the cultural factors in each country. So yes, but in legal terms there is a problem. So one needs to be a bit careful when it comes to dialogues like this or exchanges like this. Okay, there was also a conviction of a person in Canada for anti-Semitic preachings. So, what was the allegation? That Jews were treacherous, subversive, sadistic, money-loving, power-hungry, child killers, and that they created the Holocaust to gain sympathy. Not unheard of among people who hold that kind of view. It's quite common in some of the leading exponents of that viewpoint. And this conviction was held to be legal because it was seen to be crossing the line between legitimate and illegitimate speech. And while construing hate speech, the article questions we read as a whole, I've told you that before, in the absence of any, mainly to find out malicious intention, in the absence of any such intention, no offence is committed. And the court should also have regard to the class of persons for whom the article is primarily intended. I've already told you this is part of an Indian Supreme Court exposition of the law. Now again, I will give you at least one more quotation from an Indian Supreme Court case. Rational criticism, I think I already told you this before. It is to administer a shock, etc., etc. Now, there's a case from Britain where the charge was against British editor for suggesting that violence against Jews might be the only way of stopping Zionist terrorist activities against British forces. This was before the independence of Israel. And this was held to be illegal. In other words, the level of tolerance showed was quite high. Then of course satanic verses. Remember Salman Rushdie's prosecution. The intention was to prosecute the publishers of the satanic verses for the violence that followed the book's release. But that prosecution failed, with the court holding that the act of distributing the book to retail outlet could not be regarded as immediate and direct cause of unlawful violence. to which the bookseller may be subjected to by fanatics and terrorists. So again, you can't blame the publisher for distributing something which led to violence, because it's not the publisher's either intention or role when deciding whether to distribute a certain book or not. A few cases from India, you had this censorship case, film censorship case, a movie called Gian, which is dealing with the story of a Hindu boy and Muslim girl caught up in communal riots in Gujarat. And it apparently showed gruesome communal violence, characters and incidents identified with natural personalities, and was likely to aggravate violence in Gujarat. And this went to the courts after the censor board had tried to ban the movie, and the court said that the approach of the censor board was wrong and the film should be granted a certificate. In other words, there have been a number of cases in India where the censors have taken a very tough line, some would say unfair line, harsh line, in relation to certain scenes, certain dialogues, etc. But in many cases, the producers have gone to the courts, which you can do by way of judicial review, and the courts have taken a different view, saying that the censors were too cautious. There have been quite a few cases. I'll give you one or two of them as we go along. This is a case also from India, where the film concerned was the Da Vinci Code, and the reason why the film was suspended was that it was blasphemous to the Christian religion and likely to lead to agitation for communal violence. That was the reason why the film was suspended for 2 months. It was held by the court that the suspension was illegal because it violated the producer's right to freedom of expression in relation to work of fiction, which presented an alternative viewpoint on a religious matter, and the state had a duty to protect the exhibition of violence. In one sense, this is a constant refrain running through many cases. What happens is this: somebody, either in the bureaucracy or in the censor board or in the government, becomes panicky and says, you know what, this film is likely to lead to violence, why don't we ban it? That's an easy solution, because if we ban it, there won't be violence. So why needlessly take the hassle of dealing with a situation that might develop? In other words, an easy way out. They may even do it with good intention. They are not necessarily people motivated by malice. But the courts have said, sorry, that is not the approach to be taken. What you have to do is, if you fear that there is going to be violence, be prepared for it and meet the violence by getting your police force, arrest those people who are creating trouble, not by punishing the producer who has tried to do something which is otherwise acceptable. So mob violence does not mean you ban the film.
I would like to have your take on another phenomenon where the censor board has no problems with the film being released, but there are fringe groups which have a problem. For example, a number of films had faced difficulties for release in Mumbai because Mumbai was referred to as Bombay.
Correct.
And you had Raj Thackeray and their entire political party which started getting problems.
Yeah.
So what is the law, or how should the law respond in such cases where the censor board has cleared the film for certification, for exhibition, but you have had these groups creating issues?
That is a slightly more difficult problem to tackle, because in most of those cases, I imagine that the people who are unwilling to exhibit the movie would be the exhibitors, that is the theatre owners.
Yes.
They will simply say, we don't want to take the trouble of our theatres being smashed by these people, by these mobs. Now, that is very different from censorship. As you rightly say, if there was a decision of the censor board suspending the movie or banning the movie, it's easy to take it to court. But it is very difficult to take to court a situation where the exhibitor says, I don't want to show this movie. The only thing the producer can do is sue them for breach of contract, because there would have been a contract which has been breached. But that is no great help to the producer, because he can't show his movie. So I would suggest the possible solution here, which may or may not work, is for the law enforcement authorities, mainly the police, to come out extremely strongly against any attempted vandalism of this sort or threats, and to assure the exhibitors that they will be given full protection, they and their property will be given full protection if the movie goes ahead in terms of exhibition. Now, you can't compel the exhibitors even in those circumstances to relent and allow the movie to be shown. But at least the sensible among them will say, all right, if you're going to get enough protection from the police, then we should at least take a chance. Which, if they do, then the objective of allowing freedom of expression will be achieved. But it's not an easy task at all. Yeah.
So, in this regard, are there any positive obligations of the state under Article 19 or recognized by the Supreme Court to ensure that free speech is not deterred by private speech?
Absolutely, and I'm going to come to one or two cases which will illustrate that point. Very much so. It is not only a negative obligation on the part of state, but the state has a positive obligation to promote freedom of expression to the extent that it can reasonably. Of course, reasonableness comes into the picture as well. In fact, this is a good example of such a case. Rangarajan and Jagjivan Ram. What happened here was that there was a Tamil film, Ore, where what had happened was the entire issue of scheduled caste reservations was discussed. And discussed, I am told, I have not seen the movie, I am told in a fairly sober way. In other words, what the producer was trying to do was to raise questions about the wisdom and the viability in the long term of scheduled caste reservation, the reservation for scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Of course, it's a sensitive issue in India, but that does not mean you can't raise these issues for discussion. And when this movie was sought to be released, there was a threat by a group which was not happy with the idea of this whole policy being discussed. And the censors revoked the certificate that had been given. Just see, the censors became panicky. They revoked the certificate that had been given. So the producers took the case to the High Court, and the High Court gave a thundering order. Actually, the matter went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court's verdict was even more interesting. A thundering response to this pusillanimous attitude of the censor board, and the Supreme Court said that freedom of expression cannot be held to ransom by these goon squads, etc., etc. So there's a quotation there. What good is the protection of freedom of expression if the state does not take care to protect it? It's a fundamental duty of the state to protect freedom of expression. If the film is unobjectionable and cannot constitutionally be restricted in Article 19(2), let's see how careful the Supreme Court has been in formulating its proposition. Then freedom of expression cannot be suppressed on account of threat of demonstration and processions or threats of violence. That would tantamount to negation of the rule of law and a surrender to blackmail and intimidation. Very strong words, but I think completely deserved. That is the kind of approach that the Supreme Court has taken in a number of cases. And yet, you have situations arising from time to time where movies are threatened with suspension or boycott. Ramesh Dalla is another case with which some of the law students might be familiar. This had to do with Tamas, which, as you know, is a successful serial. The interesting thing here is that there was a public interest litigation which was filed by an individual, just an ordinary member of the public, who wanted the telecast to be stopped. This serial was to be telecast by Doordarshan, and this fellow went to court saying Doordarshan should be prevented from telecasting this movie. It was incidentally about the partition and the horrors of partition. And when the matter was taken up, the Bombay High Court, which heard the case, came down extremely heavily on such an attempt and said there should be absolutely no reason why, there is absolutely no reason why the teleserial should be banned, should not be shown on TV. So they said that the potential of the motion picture is as much for good as for evil. If some scenes of violence, some nuances of expression, or some events in the film can stir up certain feelings in the spectator, which was a complaint of the man who went to court. An equally deep, strong, lasting and beneficial impression can be conveyed by scenes revealing the machinations of selfish interest, scenes depicting mutual respect and tolerance, scenes showing comradeship, health and kindness which transcend the barriers of religion. In other words, what the court is saying is, look, the partition was a story of horrors, but the partition also is a story that is inspiring to future generations, at least to the extent of warning them about the need to avoid what happened during the partition. In other words, it's an educational film. I think in this case, one of the judges got so carried away that he said something like, not only should this movie not be banned, but it should be made compulsory viewing for young people or something like that. So again, done in good faith, but even then is a human. There you are. Okay, Manzar Khan is, this is a case I've already referred to. This is about a book by James Lane, who is a distinguished professor of history. He wrote a book called Shivaji, Hindu King in Islamic India. And again, a mob tried to stop this book being published in India. I'm sorry to say that Oxford University Press, which was the publisher, almost succumbed to pressures. Anyway, the case did eventually go to court, and the prosecution was ordered to be quashed. And really, what was the objectionable statement in the book? There was one statement which was the cause of all this trouble. The statement was the repressed awareness that Shivaji had an absentee father is also revealed by the fact that Maharashtrians tell jokes, naughtily suggesting that his guardian, a man called Daduji Kondev, was his biological father. Now you know what that implies. But remember, he's saying this is a joke among certain Maharashtrians. All that he's doing is this. As part of his research, he came across this. This case also involved a charge under section 153. So you can see the degree of sensitivity that is sometimes shown and the dangers they represent to freedom of expression. There is another case which involved a play, not a book, not a movie, a play called Me Naturam Buk Se Bolchor, which is about the assassination of Gandhi. And here again, the attempt to ban the play failed with the Bombay High Court, saying things like tolerance of diversity of viewpoints and acceptance of freedom to express those whose thinking may not accord with the mainstream, cardinal values, etc., etc. In other words, affirmation of the importance of free speech. Babura Patel, I've already given you a quotation from this case. This was a situation where somebody had written an article in which they called Muslims a basically violent race as intolerant and bloodthirsty, with a tradition of rape, loot and murder, and having descended from the foul Mughals. And a prosecution was brought against the author of that tract, and the court said that the prosecution was tenable. In other words, said there was justification for the prosecution given the nature of the words used, and it was likely to promote feelings of enmity, hatred, ill will, etc. between Hindus and Muslims. A West Bengal case concerning Kolkata, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm not going to go into it. Just for amusement, I put a case down there, which actually is does not lead to any great jurisprudential value. What it is an overzealous Bombay police arrested 2 executives of Hindustan Lever on charges of hurting religious sentiments after the company had released posters which showed Hanuman tearing open his chest to reveal 2 bottles of turmeric shampoo rather than images of Ram and Sita as had been depicted in Hindu mythology. Now, I don't know what you think about it, but this shows the sheer absurdity of sometimes action taken by the police. You arrest the executives of the company for something like this, and in any case, the advertisement itself, I would suggest, was not in great taste. But whatever. I mean, you don't punish somebody for bad taste. I mean, that you do on the ethical side, not by using law. Other examples would be racist abuses from Shylock and Othello by Shakespearean characters. You could think about that if you want to take something historical. Sale of Nazi memorabilia, which was an issue in France when either Amazon or eBay tried to allow the sale of these memorabilia to go ahead, and under French law it's an offense to sell Nazi memorabilia, so that you can issue there. Reports of racially sensitive speeches, I've already told you about election meetings. Racially provocative speeches made by minority extremists. minority extremists as well, not majorities against minorities, but minority extremists as well. So there we are. For a change, we've actually been able to cover all the sides. But please don't go away just for a couple of minutes. I just wanted to first of all put up something which Srivas has very kindly sent me, and it is very topical. Remember when I was talking to you about contempt of court, I was telling you that it's possible for courts to impose temporary banning orders, and this order apparently was passed and sent to the media. So there you are. It's about a case that involved certain accused in connection with the bomb blast, and what the magistrate, I think it is a magistrate, no, sorry, City Sessions Court, so the judge is trying to say is that the print media and the electronic media should not publish the names and addresses of witnesses deposing in this case, so that the safety and security of the lives of the witnesses are not compromised. Now, very interestingly, there is a huge grammatical mistake in the order which makes the effect of the order the opposite of what was intended. Can you see that? Maybe it's too small print. What it says is, the Court of the Learned Chief Judge, Kolkata, directs the print media as well as the electronic media from publishing. Basically, I think what was intended was direct the media to desist from publishing. Not, it almost seems as if it's compelling them to publish. So anyway, that's a minor matter. So that is one thing I wanted to tell you about. The other thing was also something which Snehasis very kindly drew my attention to, which I would have spoken about anyway if I had the time, was, when it comes to giving anonymity to people who appear in criminal cases, sometimes a person comes and says, you know what, if my name is publicized, then there's a risk to my life, because a mob will come and kill me or attack me. So please don't publicize my name. This is usually a plea by an accused person. The real reason may be that they don't want to be named and shamed. So they try all these tactics. And some such thing happened very recently in the UK, which was about a person who was a suspect in a child abuse case. Now you know that in the UK we've been having a number of cases involving white girls being subjected to sexual abuse by Pakistani Muslim men in large numbers. This is not an isolated incident. And because of political correctness, a large section of our media are completely unwilling to refer to the perpetrators of the offences. In other words, they will not talk about Pakistani Muslim men. At the most, they will say Asian men. Now that is very misleading. It tars a big community with one brush. Anyway, so this man, he was not convicted, but he was suspected of child abuse case, and he tried to argue that his name should not be publicized. And the Supreme Court of the UK, after weighing in many factors, came to the conclusion that such a request should not be allowed, and the name was made public. And that applies also to other situations. There was one case in Northern Ireland where a priest was brought before the courts for, again, sex abuse. And he tried to argue that if his name was publicized, then there's a risk of him being killed, and therefore his name should not be publicized. The court said no. Freedom of expression is far too important. The police should help you in guarding yourself. But there was another case where it went the other way. This was a notorious case of a toddler being brutally killed for no reason at all. On a Sunday afternoon, he was going with his father to a shopping center, and he was taken away, he separated from his father. Two youths, only about 11 years old, I think, at the time. They took him near a railway track, smashed his head, and just killed him. Jimmy Bulger was the name of the toddler. Now, these two people were, of course, sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. When they become adults, the anonymity order, in any case, because they were minors, they were entitled to anonymity normally. But the court in that case said, sorry, but the crime was so horrific that they should be named. There's a public interest in them being named and shamed. So the name was released. But then what happened was, after the age of 18, after they were released, after serving 12, 13, whatever years, the question was, can the media be allowed to identify their whereabouts? The names were known, but whereabouts. And the argument on the side of the two young men by then had been that if the media reveals their whereabouts, a mob can go and kill them, because such was the public passion against these two child killers. And their lawyers succeeded in getting an order from the court which said that they should be granted anonymity for life, and no media outlet anywhere in the world should reveal these two people's whereabouts. It's an extraordinary order, but it was justified on the grounds that you have a clash between the right to life and freedom of expression, and the right to life in this particular situation should prevail. Having said that, quite frankly, given the state of expression on the internet, many people did discover the children's whereabouts, the young men's whereabouts, but you can't do much about it. So the point is that at least the court tried to protect the lives of these two young men under controversial circumstances, because there are many people who thought that these people deserve no such protection. Anyway, so there you are. That is what I had wanted to talk about previously, which I could not. Now I'm going to make some very general points before we wind up. Please try, if you can, we only got 3 remaining days. Try if you can to turn up and to turn up on time. My so far futile but constant refrain. Secondly, do pay some attention to your assignment, the topics for which have been circulated. You're very welcome. I just want to reiterate my invitation to every one of you. You're very welcome to meet me outside class if you want to discuss anything. So far, the journalists have taken advantage of that invitation. The law students have not problems because they know everything that we've been talking about. So I don't blame them. But you're very welcome to meet me. I do enjoy meeting all of you, and feel free, therefore, to see me. I'm usually here quite early in the morning, at least by 10, probably a little earlier. So you're welcome to come. I'm in room 125.
So the trial by media did come as a mention during your lectures.
Yeah.
Do you intend to do it exclusively, trial by media and freedom of speech?
No, because I've covered all aspects of trial by media under contempt of court. What I could not do was yesterday complete my lecture because of the power failure. I was talking about the Max Mosley case, at which point we got cut off. If I get the time, now the remaining chapters, the remaining topics, as I've been saying, are relatively short. So if I get any extra time tomorrow or the day after, I'll come back to that.
So what are the topics for the 3 days later?
Can you please have a look at parliamentary privilege, national security, copyright. Copyright is a big one. Not very big one, but reasonably big one. And administrative, public order is done, that is today. Hate speech is public order. But also administrative regulations, which are not terribly important. So between the 3 or 4 of them, if we have any gaps, I'll come back to the things that I could not deal with earlier. Okay, so if there is nothing else by way of questions from you, we will stop here and I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.